Sam Kiley joins me, World Affairs Editor at The Independent. Sam, there's an awful lot swirling around our heads with this at the moment, isn't there? I found myself writing a question for my own audience for conversation. Can the UK act as a peacemaker between Trump and Zelensky? Then I immediately thought, well, that's quite telling, because Zelensky isn't at war with Trump, or he wasn't before Friday. And now it feels as though he kind of is.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, and it's very interesting how, I guess quite rightly, European leaders, particularly Keir Starmer, are still trying to maintain the United States in their own camp inside the Western tent. But actually, what we've seen over the last few weeks is a pivot by the Trump administration, not by the United States of America, but by Trump's administration into the sphere of the Kremlin. And it is not to be said lightly, and it isn't what Europe wants to see. And they are trying to mitigate that with continuing to talk to Trump and to try to talk his people around from that position. But all of the evidence points in that direction. Excuse me.
Bless you. Bless you. There's a lot of it about. And that shift into the kind of orbit of the Kremlin, what does that mean for the here and now for Ukraine? I mean, there were positive noises being made over the weekend, weren't there? Not least from Zelensky, that these talks on minerals and security can be brought back to perhaps 4 p.m. Friday afternoon. But can they?
They could conceivably be brought back, and we don't know what those mineral agreements were. The understanding was that they'd be very, very broad brush, because the original offer from the Americans was, frankly, nothing short of extortion. It would demand for back payment for a fraudulent figure, literally fraudulent figure, for what the Americans claimed that they had spent. They claimed 350 billion. The real figure is closer to 120 billion. They mostly was not loans. A lot of it was in the form of weapons that would have been scrapped anyway. So there was a lot of straightforward fraud and dodgy accounting, even in the opening offer from the Americans. And then they wanted a kind of perpetual right to 50% of Ukraine's minerals. That was rejected. And what was likely to have been signed on Friday would have been a much broader brush, essentially a memorandum of understanding that would have led down the line to further negotiated deals. But it would have given the Americans skin in the game. And it looked like it was going to work, with some very skilled diplomacy from Macron and Starmer warming up act for this meeting. And then, of course, we saw that ambush by J.D. Vance, joined in by Donald Trump against Zelensky. But I think if you look at the positions being adopted by the United States of America, they are 100% Russian positions. Not a single one of them are even European positions. There isn't even lip service being paid to the Europeans. And so the Europeans are concurrently, and I think it's a great phrase from Ursula von der Leyen there, where she was talking about the ironclad porcupine or something to make Ukraine indigestible.
I had to think about it. I must confess. When she said it, I was like, what?
Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? But I think it's a very good description. And they are rushing, I think, to try to make that happen. They're also aware, and this is what's interesting about the whole Trump debate that he started, quite aside from his slide into the Russian sphere, and part of it really is a discussion over the idea, or around the idea, that the Ukrainian effort is over, that the war, your war, my friend, is over. It isn't for the Ukrainians. I was on the front lines and near the front lines a few weeks ago. And what was striking then compared to a year prior was people were just as exhausted. There was a more significant problem with desertion from the front line. They're not having an easy ride of it, but they all were reporting that the Russians were in a terrible state. The Russians are capturing very tiny amounts of land, very, very small amounts of land, for a vast loss in terms of men and materiel. The Ukrainians are seeing far fewer tanks, armored personnel carriers, much less artillery. They feel they're not they haven't gained the upper hand, but they're definitely holding their own. And if they were given the right equipment, they could probably push the Russians back. So,
is
and the
this
Russian economy is in the toilet. So,
yeah,
in that context, why is everybody kind of trying to rush towards a peace agreement rather than
win the
uh,
war?
win the war? And that ultimately is really what the Europeans have got to start focusing on, I think. And also the once very recently unthinkable idea that certainly under Trump, but bear in mind that JD Vance is also campaigning. He's already on the campaign trail. That's why he keeps popping up, playing to his extremist gallery and hoping to get memes circulated on X and other right-wing platforms. He's campaigning, so we could be looking at another 12 years of this.
That just a word on that weakening on the front lines there of the Russian forces. Is that why we seem to be seeing more civilian drone attacks as a means to, I don't know, lower morale on Ukraine's side?
No, I don't think necessarily. They have been campaigning very, very hard indeed now for a number of years. I mean, the increase in drone attacks has been sort of notable, but not remarkable. It just means I think they've just got more drones to throw at the issue. They have been going after civilian targets from the get-go, particularly with the Shahed drones, but also the longer-range missiles, particularly energy generation facilities, including nuclear power stations.
Can I ask you just as a final question, the position of Keir Starmer in all of this? What it doesn't mean it doesn't mean he will be able to do it, but what conceivably he can achieve here?
Well, he has brought him and Macron have brought a large number of European leaders together and have moved the argument on. And I think his handling of Trump, his Trump whispering, I think impressed European leaders alongside Macron. But he was already known to have quite a good relationship with Trump, to have sort of got the measure of the man. And I think this sort of Anglo-Saxon link may be seen as a means by which they can maintain conversations with the Trump administration whilst they quietly and discreetly in the background essentially accept that the conversation is largely over. And that the United States isn't an enemy, but it really should not and cannot be seen as the central pole of a pan-Western cultural, political, and military alliance. It has pulled that pole down, and somebody else has got to hold the tent up. And I think, arguably, in the end of the day, that's going to be the European Union and the UK.
And the UK. Yesterday felt, I said finally, but yesterday felt, sorry, yeah, it was yesterday, wasn't it? Yesterday felt very pre-Brexit, didn't it, that summit?
Yeah, didn't it? You know, I mean, I've got my own views on Brexit, but they are consistent with what Vladimir Putin would like to see. He'd like to see anti-European parties doing well in Europe because the European Union is the single biggest strategic threat. Successful economic democracy like Ukraine with a large number of Russian speakers is a proper existential threat, not to Russia at all, but to Putin himself. Anybody looking over the fence from Russia into modern Ukraine, even today in a time of war, would much rather be Ukrainian than Russian, and in a material and philosophical sense, in terms of their own personal freedoms and access to an economic future of any kind of sunlight. So in that context, yeah, I mean, it was good to see European leaders, including the United Kingdom, back in the fray. And if we want to be able to protect ourselves against the depredations of Russia, which is brilliant at using social media to manipulate people's minds in the most extraordinary and straightforward way, then we are going to have to see a much, much closer union between the United Kingdom and the rest of Europe. Let's cross our fingers.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Good to talk to you. Sam Kiley, World Affairs Editor at The Independent.